B.3. Why are anarchists against private property? Private property is one of the three things all anarchists oppose, alongside hierarchical authority and the state. Today, the dominant system of private property is capitalist in nature, and as such, anarchists tend to concentrate on this system and its property rights regime. We will be reflecting this here, but do not, because of this, assume that anarchists consider other forms of private property regime, such as, say, feudalism, as acceptable. This is not the case. Anarchists are against every form of property rights regime, which results in the many working for the few. Anarchist opposition to private property rests on two related arguments. These were summed up by Proudhon's maxims, from What is Property, that property is theft and property is despotism. In his words, open quote, property violates equality by the rights of exclusion and increase, and freedom by despotism, and has perfect identity with robbery, end quote. Anarchists, therefore, oppose private property, i.e. capitalism, because it is a source of coercive, hierarchical authority, as well as exploitation and, consequently, elite privilege and inequality. It is based on and produces inequality in terms of both wealth and power. We will summarize each argument in turn. The statement "property is theft" is one of anarchism's most famous sayings. Indeed, it is no exaggeration to say that anyone who rejects this statement is not an anarchist. This maxim works in two related ways. Firstly, it recognizes the fact that the earth and its resources, the common inheritance of all, have been monopolized by a few. Secondly, it argues that, as a consequence of this, those who own property exploit those who do not. This is because those who do not own have to pay or sell their labor to those who do own in order to get access to the resources they need to live and work, such as workplaces, machinery, land, credit, housing, products under patents, and such like. See section B.3.2 for more discussion. As we discuss in section B.3.3, this exploitation, theft, flows from the fact that workers do not own or control the means of production they use and, as a consequence, are controlled by those who do during work hours. This alienation of control over labor to the boss places the employer in a position to exploit that labor, to get the worker to produce more than they get paid in wages. This is precisely why the boss employs the worker. Combine this with rent, interest, and intellectual property rights, and we find the secret to maintaining the capitalist system, as all allow enormous inequalities of wealth to continue and keep the resources of the world in the hands of a few. Yet labor cannot be alienated. Therefore, when you sell your labor, you sell yourself, your liberty, for the time in question. This brings us to the second reason why anarchists oppose private property, the fact it produces authoritarian social relationships. For all true anarchists, property is opposed as a source of authority, indeed, despotism. To quote Proudhon on this subject, open quote, "The proprietor, the robber, the hero, the sovereign, for all these titles are synonymous, imposes his will as law and suffers neither contradiction nor control. That is, he pretends to be the legislative and the executive power at once, and so property engenders despotism. That is so clearly the essence of property that, to be convinced of it, one need but remember what it is and observe what happens around him. Property is the right to use and abuse. If goods are property, why should not the proprietors be kings, and despotic kings in proportion to their facultas bonitaris? And if each proprietor is sovereign lord within the sphere of his property, absolute king throughout his own domain, how could a government of proprietors be anything but chaos and confusion?" End quote. In other words, private property is the state writ small, with the property owner acting as the sovereign lord over their property, and so the absolute king of those who use it. As in any monarchy, The worker is the subject of the capitalist, having to follow their orders, laws, and decisions while on their property. This obviously is the total denial of liberty and dignity, we may note, as it is degrading to have to follow orders. And so private property, capitalism, necessarily excludes participation, influence, and control by those who use, but do not own, the means of life. It is, of course, true that private property provides a sphere of decision-making free from outside interference, but only for the property's owners. But for those who are not property owners, the situation is radically different. In a system of exclusively private property does not guarantee them any such sphere of freedom. They have only the freedom to sell their liberty to those who do own private property. If I am evicted from one piece of private property, where can I go? Nowhere, unless another owner agrees to allow me access to their piece of private property. This means that everywhere I can stand is a place where I have no right to stand without permission, and, as a consequence, I exist only by the sufferance of the property-owning elite. Hence Proudhon, open quote, just as the commoner once held his land by the munificence and condescension of the lord, so today the working man holds his labor by the condescension and necessities of the master and proprietor, end quote. This means that far from providing a sphere of independence, a society in which all property is private thus renders the propertyless completely dependent on those who own property. This ensures that the exploitation of another's labor occurs and that some are subjected to the will of others, in direct contradiction to what the defenders of property promise. This is unsurprising given the nature of the property they are defending. Open quote. Our opponents are in the habit of justifying the right to private property by stating that property is the condition and guarantee of liberty. And we agree with them. Do we not say repeatedly that poverty is slavery? But then why do we oppose them? The reason is clear. In reality, the property that they defend is capitalist property, namely, property that allows its owners to live from the work of others and which, therefore, depends on the existence of a class of the disinherited and dispossessed, forced to sell their labor to the property owners for a wage below its real value. This means that workers are subjected to a kind of slavery, which, though it may vary in degree of harshness, always means social inferiority, material penury, and moral degradation, and is the primary cause of all the ills that beset today's social order. End quote. It will, of course, be objected that no one forces a worker to work for a given boss. However, as we discussed in section B.4.3, this assertion, while true, misses the point. While workers are not forced to work for a specific boss, they inevitably have to work for a boss. This is because there is literally no other way to survive. All other economic options have been taken from them by state coercion. The net effect is that the working class has little choice but to hire themselves out to those with property, and, as a consequence, the laborer, open quote, has sold and surrendered his liberty, end quote, to the boss. Private property, therefore, produces a very specific form of authority structure within society, a structure in which a few govern the many during working hours. These relations of production are inherently authoritarian and embody and perpetuate the capitalist class system. The moment you enter the factory gate or the office door, you lose all your basic rights as a human being. You have no freedom of speech, nor association, and no right of assembly. If you were asked to ignore your values, your priorities, your judgment, and your dignity, and leave them at the door when you enter your home, you would rightly consider that tyranny, yet that is exactly what you do during working hours if you are a worker. You have no say in what goes on. You may as well be a horse, to use John Locke's analogy, see section B.4.2, or a piece of machinery. Little wonder, then, that anarchists oppose private property, as anarchy is, open quote, the absence of a master, of a sovereign, end quote, and call capitalism for what it is, namely wage slavery. For these reasons, anarchists agree with Rousseau when he stated, open quote, "The first man having fenced off a plot of land thought of saying, 'This is mine,' and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. How many crimes, wars, murders, how many miseries and horrors might the human race have been spared by the one who, upon pulling up the stakes or filling in the ditch, had shouted to his fellow men, 'Beware of listening to this impostor. You are lost if you forget the fruits of the earth belong to all, and that the earth belongs to no one.'" End quote. This explains anarchist opposition to capitalism. It is marked by two main features: private property, or in some cases, state-owned property, see section B.3.5, and consequently, wage labor and exploitation and authority. Moreover, such a system requires a state to maintain itself for, open quote, "as long as within society a possessing and non-possessing group of human beings face one another in enmity, the state will be indispensable to the possessing minority for the protection for its privilege." End quote. Thus, private ownership of the means of production is only possible if there is a state, meaning mechanisms of organized coercion, at the disposal of the propertied class. See section B.2. Also, it ought to be easy to see that capitalism, by giving rise to an ideologically inalienable right to private property, will also quickly give rise to inequalities in the distribution of external resources, and that this inequality in resource distribution will give rise to a further inequality in the relative bargaining positions of the propertied and the propertyless. While apologists for capitalism usually attempt to justify private property by claiming that self-ownership is a universal right, see section B.4.2, is capitalism based on self-ownership, it is clear that capitalism actually makes universal autonomy implied by the flawed concept of self-ownership, for the appeal of the notion of self-ownership rests on the ideal that people are not used as a means, but only as an end in themselves. The capitalist system, however, has undermined autonomy and individual freedom, and, ironically, has used the term self-ownership as the basis for doing so. Under capitalism, as will be seen in section B.4, most people are usually left in a situation where their best option is to allow themselves to be used in just those ways that are logically incompatible with genuine self-ownership, i.e., the autonomy which makes it initially an appealing concept. Only libertarian socialism can continue to affirm the meaningful autonomy and individual freedom which self-ownership promises, whilst building the conditions that guarantee it. Only by abolishing private property can there be access to the means of life for all, so making the autonomy, which self-ownership promises but cannot deliver, a reality, by universalizing self-management in all aspects of life. Before discussing the anti-libertarian aspects of capitalism, it will be necessary to define private property as distinct from personal possessions, and show in more detail why the former requires state protection and is exploitative.